This is going to be hopefully an exciting and informative conversation about where U.S. foreign policy is headed with the 2008 elections looming, and certainly there have been some developments in recent days that have refocused attention on foreign policy. I'm going to be moderating tonight's discussion. We are very fortunate to have with us two distinguished experts to help shed some light on the future role that America is going to play on the world stage. Tonight's event, I should mention first, is sponsored by Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School, and we hope throughout the course of about the next hour or so to provide some analysis of and solutions to some of the pressing problems facing the United States, the world at large, and whomever becomes president in 2009. As we look down the road a year from now to the 2008 elections, overall I think the mood of the country is one of uncertainty in the foreign policy arena. Americans are asking many, many questions. Among them, when will our troops come home from Iraq? Where is this nuclear crisis with Iran headed? What will our relations with China be like? And what's the status of the war on terror and in Afghanistan now that Pakistan, for the second time in 8 years, has declared military rule? And of course, all of this is happening at the same time as America's standing in the world is perhaps worse than it has been at any time in the past few decades. I hope I've cheered you all up with that preface here. The good news is, though, that we've got some fine experts with us tonight to help point a way forward. So I'll just take a second here to explain for you the format for tonight's discussion. We're going to start with a conversation with our two experts, and then we'll open up the floor to your questions. We have two microphones here. Please, when you address a question to our panelists, you phrase it in the form of a question as opposed to a statement. And with that, let me briefly introduce our panelists. First, we have Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is the Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, author of the new book, The Idea That Is America. She's also the academic co-director of the Princeton Project on National Security, which is a multi-year bipartisan effort designed to craft a new national security strategy for the United States. She's also been spending an awful lot of time in Shanghai, one of the fastest developing cities in the world. She'll be here, she said, long enough to get back on American time, and then she'll be heading back over to China again. So she's living a life of jet lag, which I know something about. Getting up at 2:30 in the morning, you're kind of permanently jet lagged. Also with us tonight is Barbara Slavin. She's the senior diplomatic reporter for USA Today. Prior to joining that fine newspaper, she was a Washington-based writer for The Economist and also the Los Angeles Times. She also has a new book out called Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S., and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. We were supposed to be joined, I should mention very quickly tonight, by Mark Penn, who is Hillary Clinton's pollster for the Hillary Clinton campaign. He unfortunately called in sick. He does have a new book out as well, though. It's called Microtrends, the Small Forces Behind Tomorrow's Big Changes, and by remarkable coincidence, all three of our panelists' books are available out front in the reception area. And we included Mark's book tonight as well, even though he's not here. Needless to say, a great couple of people, a great couple of experts to discuss all things pressing as we look toward the future here. And so let's get the conversation started. Anne-Marie, maybe you could start us off with your thoughts on this particular issue. I was going to start with a broad look at foreign policy, sort of from the 30,000-foot level, but I think the events in Pakistan over the last 3 days really warrant a close-in look. The U.S., it seems, Anne-Marie, is really in a pickle over what to do in Pakistan. Here the Bush administration has been promoting this idea of fostering the spread of democracy and an end to tyranny, as the President articulated in his 2005 inaugural address. But then at the same time, you have to sometimes deal with the cards that you're dealt. You have to deal with the people who you've made friends with because of the consequences of not doing so. So first of all, what happened to get us here with Pakistan, and more importantly, where do we go from here? How do you find a way out?
Yeah, I'd prefer to focus on all the things that we've done wrong rather than to tell you what we now have to do. But of course, that is the essential question. I do want to, let me start though by talking about, as you say, the contradiction we're in Pakistan, and not only in Pakistan, in Uzbekistan and other countries around the world, where on the one hand we declare that we are, our goal, our foreign policy goal is to end tyrannies, and that we are focused on supporting democracy, promoting democracy, and then, of course, we are working very closely with non-democratic governments that we need. And we needed Pakistan for help in the war on terror. It's actually not at all clear that they have been giving us the kind of help we need, and certainly they're not giving us the kind of help we need in Afghanistan. But one implication is, we just shouldn't be talking about democracy. We should just be honest about, you're nodding, but I'm not going to agree, that we should just be honest that, like any other power, we, pursue our interests, and we don't care what a government does to its own people or what kind of system it is. We just care about how they can advance our interests. I don't think that's right, but I also think the way we've been talking about advancing democracy or promoting democracy has gotten us into lots of trouble, and this is a classic example where right now we look hypocritical and we have no leverage. So we're neither advancing democracy nor do we have the kind of leverage even to keep Musharraf from declaring martial law. So let me say what I think we should have done, but then let me say what I think we have to do now. I argue in my book and in the Princeton Project on National Security, John Eikenberry and I argued that instead of focusing on promoting democracy, we should talk about governments around the world, including our own, as being up to par, as being popular, accountable, and rights-regarding, which is I think, a much more sensible formula for long-term democracy, liberal democracy. But in the Pakistani context, what it would have mean is pushing Musharraf to adopt a wider system of consultation, to be more accountable, pushing him on human rights, rather than sort of saying, look, you got to hold elections or you don't, when right now it's not clear who is even going to run. That kind of approach would have allowed us to work with him, but to also push on specific areas where there's a real metric. At this point, what we mostly want is for things not to blow up. I would be working intensively behind the scenes, which I assume we are doing, I certainly hope so, with all NATO countries. All the NATO countries are involved in Afghanistan, and if things really turn into a massive civil conflict, that will be even worse for Afghanistan. So I would be pushing on with China, with NATO countries, every other country where we think we'd have some influence, to simply keep the situation as stable as possible, and to try to find a relatively face-saving way for Musharraf to share power, not with an election initially and then him moving, but gradually sharing power, and see if we can back ourselves off the precipice.
Barbara, what's your sense of this, Barbara? Did the U.S. wed itself too closely to one person? And if not Musharraf, then who?
Yeah, I sympathize with the administration. It really didn't have any choice after September 11th but to ally with Pakistan, although it does seem another manifestation of what I call Bush's reverse Midas touch. Everyone he embraces eventually disappoints in one way or another, it seems, or can't fulfill the mission. Obviously, the U.S. has tried to push Musharraf repeatedly, but when you're getting $10 billion from the Bush administration on the one hand, you tend perhaps not to listen to the admonitions about democracy on the other. So it's been a very difficult situation. I would agree with Anne-Marie to try to stabilize the situation, talk to the Chinese who have some leverage, continue to push him to spread the power around, perhaps with Benazir Bhutto, but I have a gut feeling somehow that the Pakistani military is going to decide this. If the moves that he's made are sufficiently unpopular that people really do start coming out in the streets in a major way, I would imagine that someone else within the military might come forward. That's been the standard pattern in Pakistan, and I have no reason to believe that it would be different. One just hopes that whoever replaces him will be someone who has some kind of commitment to dealing with al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I tell you, I don't want to get into the Iran subject quite yet, but I was thinking as all of this was breaking that it would be nice if we had better relations with Iran, to have bad relations with Pakistan and bad relations with Iran is about the worst formula I can think of.
Yeah, bad relations with Pakistan, bad relations with Iran, and a war going on next door in Afghanistan.
And a war, yes, and not to mention Iraq
Sort
as
of
well.
a
It's
perfect
another
triangle,
manifestation of the Iraq effect, too, because I'm sure Musharraf figured he could get away with anything because Bush is distracted and by Iraq.
Yeah. Well, let's back up then to that 30,000-foot level and go forward when talking about all of that and what U.S. foreign policy should be. Of course, in January of 2009, we'll have a new foreign policy chief in the White House. We talked about the foreign policy vision that President Bush articulated in his 2005 inaugural. Anne-Marie, what do you think should be the foreign policy vision of the next president of the United States?
Well, I think the vision ought to be what we've called a world of liberty under law, which is a world in which you stand for and help individuals and societies around the world achieve not democracy as we define it, but liberty under law as our founders sought for us, which again comes down to order in the first instance. It means when you look at a society, you recognize that all societies need basic order before they can do anything else, and then systems that secure liberty, increasing liberty. Again, there are many different ways of looking at that. That's also, though, a vision of the world that says you need international rules as well as domestic rules, that a world of liberty under law is also a world in which nations are governed by rules where there is an international order as well as domestic order, which means the United States is standing for building that order, for making institutions work, for reaching solutions collaboratively. It doesn't mean that, you know, we we subject our interests to collective decisions, but it means we recognize that we are the largest power, and we should be using that power to build the order, to strengthen the order, to reform the order in ways that allow us to tackle everything from terrorism to global warming to pandemics.
Barbara, in the 2000 campaign, President Bush pledged a humble foreign policy. He also said the United States military is not going to get involved in nation building. We all know how that turned out. Right. So where should the next president go? You know,
I guess I'm a neo-realist. I think that's what I am. That's what I heard the other day. This is the new term. First, do no harm. First, do no harm. You know, when we look at the situation in 2000, I mean, we only wish we could get back to where we were when Bush came in. He has stirred the pot so many times. The pieces are all up in the air. We don't know where most of them are going to come down. So, yeah, first do no harm. Then try to reconnect with our traditional allies, try to expand the base. I agree with Anne-Marie that we should be working through international organizations more, trying to certainly work on issues like climate change. I mean, you know, this is something that the whole planet can agree on, and where there are real dangers facing us. Frankly, I would argue this is, I think many people would argue this is the greatest threat facing humanity right now. Far more than an Iranian nuclear program or whether there's a new general in Pakistan. And yeah, you know, be humble. Say we don't have all the solutions, and we need to talk to others and get their ideas, and hopefully together we can come up with some solutions. But certainly no grand schemes for regime change or democracy promotion. These are processes that have to work on their own, and they can only work in an environment that is non-threatening and conducive to it. When you start threatening countries, that's the worst possible environment for them to try to start making democratic reforms.
So what then should happen with this Bush doctrine, the doctrine of preemption?
It should be buried.
All right, let's drill down to some of the other issues besides Pakistan. Anne-Marie, Iraq, if you were in charge, would you stick it out with the military there in hopes of bringing some stability to the country eventually, or would you draw down troops and hope that in doing so you'd put pressure on the Iraqis to step up to the plate?
I think I'd draw down. We're going to have to draw down. We're going to have to withdraw. We can't sustain current levels even now. We know that. The question is, how do you withdraw? I think if I were president, I think for actually probably any president other than possibly John McCain. But even John McCain, I don't think can convince the country to maintain troops. But the question is, how do you withdraw so that, A, you don't create a situation that's even worse, where we have to go back in or others have to go back in?
How do you prevent the bloodbath?
Right. And so in my view, we will have substantial numbers of troops there probably for 5 years, but we will get major combat troops out. The real key is that there has to be a regional solution, and this actually goes back to Pakistan as well, that we need to be thinking about the region from essentially India all the way through to the Mediterranean. We need to be thinking about how you solve interconnected issues from the Israeli-Palestinian settlement through to Iraq and Iran, and then through to India and Pakistan. And you need to think about building institutions in the Middle East. That is the least institutionalized area of anywhere in the world. I'm sitting in Asia right now, South Asia, North Asia. There are countless formal and informal institutions where people can actually come together and interact in maybe very, over water, over the environment, not over the key disputes. And there's none of that in the Middle East. And a long-term strategy for Iraq says it's not just Iraq, Iraq is part of the region, and we need to work to strengthen the region.
Barbara, as you know, in his recent speech on Iraq, President Bush illuminated the idea that the Iraqi government has asked him for a long-term strategic relationship with the United States. What should that look like? First of all, should we engage in one? And B, what should it look like?
Well, that's assuming that this current Iraqi government remains in power and has those interests. We don't know what's going to happen. If the U.S. were to attack Iran, for example, I would argue that the Maliki government would have a very difficult time cooperating with the Bush administration, since it's also very closely tied to Iran. I like Anne-Marie's idea about some more organizations. I mean, there's the Arab League, but that's just the Arab countries. There's the Organization of Islamic Conference, which is the Muslim countries, but it's very large and brings in Southeast Asia and parts of the world that really don't pertain. There's the GCC, which represents the Gulf states, but it doesn't have other members in it. So I think some sort of new security forum that would bring everybody in and that would meet on a regular basis would be a very good idea. I don't know where you would put it, though. That might be a problem.
One of the small states.
Maybe, yeah, put it in Qatar or Oman or something like that, one of the little neutral states, and have a little secretariat there. That might be a very good idea to help resolve these issues.
And just before we leave this topic, presidential candidate Joe Biden insists that he's the only one that's got a plan for fixing what's gone wrong in Iraq. And it's this idea of 3 semi-autonomous regions. He doesn't call it partitioning, but it's de facto partitioning. Would that fly?
I think that's what's already happened and is happening. You have a separate Kurdistan, you have a south of Iraq, and much of Baghdad now, which is Shia-controlled, and then you have the Sunni region. There's been enormous ethnic cleansing. People talk about the casualty figures coming down. That's because much of the ethnic cleansing has already happened. Mm-hmm. And so you do already have spheres of influence where different ethnic groups predominate. I wouldn't call it a formal partition. I think that's a bad idea, because perhaps things could change over time. But that's certainly where it's headed now.
Barbara, Anne-Marie, you were shaking your head.
Well, no, I'm agreeing with that, but I think the problem is the premise that he has a plan for Iraq. If we haven't learned anything, it's that we can't have a plan for Iraq. The Iraqis have to have a plan, and we can support it if we want to. We can not support it, but the idea that we're going to decide that Iraq now should be soft partitioned or hard partitioned, forget it. What's happening on the ground means that there are different realities for them to decide how they're going to do this, and whether they're going to keep fighting to a standstill or whether, in fact, they're going to find some fragile idea. But back to the humble, whether it's the humble superpower or it's a more chastened America is the way I think about it. We should start by not saying we have a plan for another country.
All right, let's move next door and talk about our plan for Iran.
Getting out of the mess.
All of this saber rattling, Barbara, the New York Times last week ran an editorial that said that President Bush continues to confuse bullying with grand strategy. Is that right in this particular instance?
Well, I actually do. I do understand some of the rationale behind the language. no president should take options off the table. Obviously, if Iran had a bomb and there was knowledge that it was going to use it against Israel or Saudi Arabia or something like that, the United States would have to step in. But I would argue we're a long way from that kind of situation. The problem with the rhetoric, it's like the democracy promotion. It would be great if it worked. But, when it's threats and there's really not that much behind it, it just makes the United States look like a paper tiger. I don't think the Iranians believe that the Bush administration is going to mount an attack on them. I hope they're right. I think there still is a possibility that could occur, but they don't think it's going to happen. There is a U.S. strategy that is working in a sense, and that is some of these sanctions, particularly the banking sanctions, which are really having an impact on Iran when you combine them with the mismanagement of their own government, of President Ahmadinejad. And I would stick with that. I would tone down the rhetoric. I think it's unnecessary, and it just gets the Iranians back up. It gets ordinary Iranians concerned and makes them more patriotic and nationalistic, and that's not really serving U.S. purposes.
Okay, there are many analysts who say that the one thing that an attack on Iran would do is, rather than create a wedge between the mullahs and rank-and-file Iranians, is it would cement that relationship and they would go forward as one people in this renewed sense of nationalism. This talk, Anne-Marie, that President Bush engaged in a few weeks back, where he said it would be World War III if they possessed the knowledge, just the knowledge, to develop a bomb. I asked former President Carter about this in an interview last week. He thought that was a foolish statement. Democrat speaking about a Republican, perhaps not surprising. But what's your sense? Can Iran be allowed to build a bomb, or can it be allowed to possess even the knowledge to do it?
I certainly think it can be allowed to possess the knowledge. I don't see how we can stop a nation from possessing the knowledge of how to do it. The issue of whether we should allow them to have a weapon is a different one. But that in my understanding, is some years off. And what we ought to be doing, if we want to really stop that, is to follow the prescription of no less than George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and Bill Perry and Sam Nunn, to say, we have to live up to our part of the bargain under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have to start disarming and cutting our stocks so that we then have the legitimacy to actually lead a more effective global pressure on Iran and other states. Right now, we don't have any legitimacy on this subject. So I would work much harder on strengthening the non-proliferation regime and working not just with the Europeans, but with many other states in the region who can, and also elsewhere in the world, who can put pressure on Iran and make Iran really feel isolated.
Barbara, well, go ahead.
There's another thing that U.S. could do, and that is support the idea, which has been out there for a long time, about an international consortium to produce enriched uranium. El Baradei has been talking about this. And the Iranians, when I interviewed them, complained that they actually own 10% of an organization called Eurodif. Right. But they've never gotten 1 gram of uranium, as they put it, despite owning that.
So they see it as a national security issue, that they want to have control of the enriched uranium process.
Absolutely, they do. And if one could actually start up this consortium and have it work and function in a way that could be seen as truly apolitical, that might go a long way to convincing them perhaps not to go all the way on their fuel cycle.
The way that North Korea was dealt with was a combination of sticks and carrots. It's all stick when it comes to Iran now. Do we need to throw some carrots in?
There's some carrots out there. Unfortunately, the carrots are little ones, and they came way too late. One of the things I argue about in my book, there were opportunities to negotiate with the Iranians. There were even talks from 2001 through May 2003, and then there was an offer by the Iranians for comprehensive negotiations, which the Bush administration never took up. So the Europeans stepped into the breach, and they negotiated for a couple of years. The Iranians actually suspended the program, and then the Europeans put down an offer in would have been July, I guess, of 2005, just before Ahmadinejad came in, which had some carrots. The U.S. agreed that it would stop blocking Iran's efforts to join the World Trade Organization and sell it some spare parts for their civilian airliners. That was sort of a sweetener. But It was too little. It was too late.
So this opportunity for dialogue, has that gone away now that Ahmadinejad is president, or will the next president of this country have a chance to recoup that?
I don't think the opportunity ever goes away. Even after Ahmadinejad came in, his national security advisor, Ali Larijani, also made overtures to the United States in the winter of 2005-2006, and he was rebuffed, and I would argue that's one of the things that led to his resignation just 2 weeks ago as their chief nuclear negotiator, because he was hemmed in between American neoconservatives and Iranian neoconservatives. I think that you always have to offer. Whether it would work, obviously the chances are a lot smaller now than they would have been in 2003.
Let's move on to China, which is something, Anne-Marie, you know an awful lot about, having been spending a lot of time in Shanghai, and again, as we said, going back there again. What do we do about a rising China, China rising from their increasing diplomatic clout, the fact that they hold an enormous amount of U.S. debt, rising economic power, differences with the U.S. and the West about issues like human rights? How do we deal with China when we are so inextricably linked in this increasingly globalized world, particularly when you look at the fact that just about everything that we use is made in China these days?
So let me begin by saying I'm in China for a year. I'm on my sabbatical for a year, but I'm there so my children will end up knowing much more about China and actually learning Mandarin. And I'm a Europeanist, not an Asianist, and we've got some great Asianists in the audience. But what I will say, after living there for 2.5 months and traveling interior in Sichuan and coming down the Yangtze and as much as we could, the overwhelming sense that you have is that China has so many domestic issues. The idea that that's what they're focused on, the idea that they're focused on rising and challenging us when the environmental conditions are almost undescribable. I was saying that I landed at National Airport on Thursday night and started sucking in the air because it seemed like it was Yellowstone. It was so crystalline after what I've been breathing. And I'm in Shanghai, and it's better in Shanghai than it is in Beijing, and certainly than Chengdu or Chongqing, any of the interior cities. But also just the tremendous distance they still have to go in terms of development. I mean, even in Shanghai, which everybody thinks of as their showcase, as their westernized city, if you're where I live, which is very nice, but is in the western part of the city, it's still, you go in one block from a skyscraper to crumbling sidewalks and little shops and people brushing their teeth on the street in the morning. And of course, when you go further inland, you realize that you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who still are not part of the economic miracle. So the overwhelming sense is what we need to do with China is to allow them and help them as best we can to deal with their domestic issues, do what we, I think, are doing rightly right now, which is to avoid a crisis on Taiwan, or to do everything we can to avoid a crisis on Taiwan, and to hope that a combination of our currency depreciating and eventually theirs also, we get to a kind of soft economic landing on both sides. They've got to cool down their economy, and we are inextricably linked. But the idea that China is the threat and it is looking to counter us, maybe in 20 years, but not till then.
But what about that point, Barbara? And I think President Bush was very prescient about this when, during one of the debates in 2000, he said, I don't see China as a strategic partner as the Clinton administration did. I see it as a strategic competitor. And certainly it's competing for oil reserves around the world. PetroChina is now the largest company, the highest capitalization of any company in the world. They are massively building up their military. Anne-Marie said they may not be a threat today, but 20 years from now, they certainly could be a threat. So how do you deal with that looking in the long term?
It's ironic, actually. I don't think Bush has treated them as a strategic competitor at all. He's really leaned on them for issue after issue, problem after problem. We saw with the six-party talks with North Korea that if not for the Chinese, we wouldn't have even been talking to the North Koreans perhaps by now. The U.S. has also worked with the Chinese on Darfur, pressured them, and the Chinese named a special envoy for Darfur. So I think the U.S. has been working rather well with the Chinese. That's actually, a good story, a good news story for this administration in terms of, spreading responsibility around. It may be just because they were exhausted by Iraq and they had no alternative, but I think that still is good, and I think the whole idea of the responsible stakeholder, which Bob Zellick, when he was at the State Department, put forward, and this is all to the good. We need China. China's economy is so powerful. Its impact on everything from global warming to natural resources is so huge that we really need to be working even more closely with the Chinese and not worry about strategic competition so much.
No, as we work our way around the world, north and west a little bit to Russia, increasing autocratic rule by Vladimir Putin, marginalizing the opposition. Are we headed back to the bad old days?
Ну да. I'm not sure anyone has a really good idea of what to do with Russia right now. We don't have much leverage. It does come back to what I was saying earlier about instead of focusing on elections and thinking about, gee, they've held elections, so they're a democracy, so we support them, we should have been focusing on the fact that for most ordinary Russians, democracy meant chaos. It meant no order, no ability to predict, to improve your standard of living, and that was the time to be engaging them and helping them, but recognizing that it was not enough to simply have an elected official. So it's not surprising, to me anyway, that ordinary Russians are embracing Putin in the way they are. What you're also seeing is, back to when I studied Russia at Princeton, this constant back and forth between, those people who want to be more part of Europe and those people who are much more intensely nationalistic and are thinking about, a Slavophile power, and Russia is going to have to sort that out for itself. In my view, the one thing we can do is where we can work with them, and Iran's actually a good case, because I don't think Russia wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon. We need to be giving them the kind of recognition that they crave as a power. I mean, the one thing when you talk to Russians, here they were the superpower, we were the superpower. 1989, 1991, Soviet Union dissolves, and they just fall off the map. Nobody ever talks about Russia in the United States. I would go to talks and give talks, and occasionally a Russian in the audience would say, but, what about Russia? And that's, it's deeply humiliating. And it's not surprising that they now feel that Putin is once again restoring their power in the world setting. I think we can help with that, at least in taking account and working with them on the issues where we do have common interests. There are plenty of others. We're going to just be at loggerheads, but there are a few.
There were a couple strategic mistakes, too, that the Bush administration made. I mean, coming in and immediately insisting on getting rid of the ABM treaty and pushing missile defense, expanding NATO, all the rest. I mean, some of this obviously started under Clinton, but, the Russians finally said enough is enough. These are agreements that provided the foundation of their dealings with the West, their dealings with the United States, and I think they just got tired of being pushed around.
Missile defense in the Czech Republic and Poland. Good idea,
this
bad
is,
idea?
Over the top. I mean, for what? Iran isn't going to attack the Czech Republic. What is this for? I don't get it, except that the administration has a commitment to missile defense. Billions and billions of dollars go down a hole to contractors who perhaps give money to the Republican Party. I don't know. I think it's a program that has never proven itself particularly well, and it has antagonized many U.S. allies. I think one of the reasons the Bush administration came in determined to get rid of the agreed framework with North Korea was because it wanted an excuse to do missile defense.
I want to open it up to questions in just a second, but there's one more issue that I was particularly curious about, given the slide in the American dollar, how much the debt has risen in the last few years. Does America risk its place in the world as an economic power, with China on the rise? And it's going to be a long time before they really become an economic superpower, but it looks like they're on their way. With Europe now resurgent, with so many foreign entities, particularly China, holding so much debt, is there a risk that while we may still have that hard military power, we risk losing our soft power?
Well, we've lost a lot of our soft power, although I mean our economic power. Yes, in the sense that is the dollar what it once was? No, I mean the euro is a very attractive currency, and there is talk longer term of the Asians actually, creating a currency, also a basket currency.
I read today that supermodel Gisele Bundchen wants to get paid in anything but American dollars.
American dollars. On the other hand, if you look at where is still the safest place for investment, America's doing just fine, and frankly, as things get more chaotic, I think you see people coming back into the U.S. We're still the biggest market globally, and we are so essential. Our consuming is so essential to China being where it is, but not just China. China's the front of the sort of Asian factory, so all those countries in Asia, that I actually don't think, they can't afford to have us, our economy go completely south. We can't afford to have their economy go south. So I think there's going to be there's a natural adjustment. I mean, we are basically in some ways, and heading to a multipolar world, not the world that Jacques Chirac was talking about, but a world in which there are multiple centers of economic power and increasingly multiple centers of political power. But that doesn't mean the United States is not still a great power, still the largest power, and still the power that has the single greatest effect on world affairs, if only because none of this stuff can be happening, none of the economic growth, none of the good things we see without peace. And the United States is still the country that's waging war in some areas, but at least in Asia, it's the country that's holding the balance of the peace, whether it's between China and Japan, whether it's in Korea, whether it's in Southeast Asia, and we're still essential players.
Yeah, I was born in Canada, and I remember taking a school trip to Niagara Falls back in the 1960s, and the Canadian dollar was worth $1.07 American. And of course, when I grew up and started buying and selling properties, as I was moving back and forth across the border, I was on the losing end of the stick in terms of exchange rates. But it's interesting to see it back up there again. This has been terrific. Some great insight. Let's throw the floor open to questions. As I said, got a couple of microphones up there, and if you'd be kind enough to phrase your question in the form of a question, I think that'll go a long way to furthering the discussion as well. So. You've been so great, nobody's got anything left to talk about.
No.
Go ahead, come on up here to the microphone.
This is a Princeton audience, there are always questions.
A two-part question from both the panelists, if I could. One, it's titled, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World, Dilemma of Our Foreign Policy. What role, if any, do you see of the draft in that domestic policy and the foreign policy around the world? That's number one. Number two, I'm still confused about what is the war on terror, and I'd like to have each of your comments on what is the war on terror, what is terror. I'm still confused by it. Thank you.
You want to handle that draft question first?
Well, in the draft, I'm a mother of a 17-year-old, soon-to-be 18-year-old son, so I'm against it. Do you have thoughts? No, seriously. I think some sort of public service for our young men and women after college or before college might be a good idea. The problem is, though, that when you have an administration that keeps going into war after war, how do you decide which ones actually go and put their lives on the line and which ones get to go and teach in a school?
The other thing I would say about the draft, I spent this morning with Paul Volcker and a number of other alums and non-alums on a task force that we've put together on the changing nature of government service. And one of the things we heard about was the extraordinary amount of outsourcing of government functions. And part of that, of course, is there are more contractors on the ground in Iraq than there are U.S. soldiers. Now, what that means is instead of having a draft, we've outsourced a lot of the security, a lot of the other things, so that we're avoiding the kind of sacrifice that would cause a huge public debate. This war would have been over much sooner if there had been a draft. We're avoiding those political choices because we are outsourcing to private contractors who are doing this for money. On the war on terror, Anthony Zinni was at the Woodrow Wilson School 2 years ago and was just adamant, you can't wage war on a tactic. You can wage war on an enemy. The enemy is global terrorist networks, Any terrorist group that has global reach, that can reach us, that can reach our allies, there are many different names, but that's the actual enemy. Now, in my view, that is much closer to a global insurgency in terms of a conflict model than it is a war. It needs to be countered by a combination of intelligence, law enforcement, transnational cooperation in law enforcement, and special forces. I think there's room for all three, but that's not a war. And I actually think calling it a war is playing right into al-Qaeda's hands. That's what al-Qaeda wants. They want a war, and they want to be holy warriors. So I would stop using the term, as the Pentagon suggested a couple years ago. They wanted to call it the global struggle against violent extremism, and the president said, no, we're at a war. But
it's a mouthful.
Yeah, well, whatever the acronym, the point is what we are doing is fighting global terrorist networks. You can say we're fighting al-Qaeda, we're fighting specific groups, but this notion that we're waging a war on a tactic is not helpful.
Rudy Giuliani calls it the terrorist war against us.
Yeah. You know, I think we do elevate them when we use this term, but I would shade that a little bit. I think that one of the problems with the Bush administration policy is that it's been too broad. He attacked too many people at once. You can't go after every terrorist organization that has some sort of global aspect to it. I think the big mistake he made in strategic terms was not keeping it focused on al-Qaeda. Had he focused on al-Qaeda, which was the organization that attacked the United States, he could have brought together many more allies against it, and probably would have been a great deal more successful. It was in deciding he was going to go after everybody, you know, especially, of course, Iraq, when Saddam, yes, he supported terrorist groups, just not that terrorist group. I think that was the big mistake, that he lost the focus.
Next question.
Evans Revere, the president of the Korea Society and a recent retiree from the State Department. First of all, let me just commend you for putting this forum together. I think it's been an extremely valuable evening thus far. I'm also a Vietnam-era veteran, and I have to agree with Anne-Marie's point about the draft. I think if we had one today, we'd be in a very different situation. My question is the following. Irrespective of the outcome of the next American election, we will have a new president and a new foreign policy team. And one of the challenges, perhaps the biggest challenge that that new president will have to deal with, is an international environment that has undoubtedly become much more cynical, skeptical, and perhaps even hostile towards America as a result of the last several years. Say what you will about the policies, but it's a fact that it's a much more difficult world to sell our product, if you will, out there, our foreign policy out there, than it ever has been. If you were, and let me address this to our two panelists, if you were advising the next U.S. administration and you had to suggest 2 or 3 things that ought to be right at the top of the list of our next president's foreign policy priorities, what would those be?
Okay, well, I'm a journalist. I'm not supposed to be giving these kinds of prescriptions. These are just my personal views. And Evans and I met 25 years ago in China, so I guess we've had discussions like this before. I mentioned this to Anne-Marie at a luncheon we were at last week, that I would join the International Criminal Court. I think that would be a huge symbol that the United States feels that it's not above the law, that it's not above international law, and that it's confident enough that its military performs within the rule of law, that it's willing to subject itself to that. It would be I think it would be just a huge demonstration. Closing Guantanamo, clearly, moving those people. If you can't send them back to their homes, put them in prisons in the United States and give them proper trials, one after the other. Those 2 things, I think, would certainly go a long way. So I completely agree on the International Criminal Court in terms of the effect, certainly in Europe enormously, probably less so in some other parts of the world. But if I were advising the president, I'd have to also say that would be a little like Clinton with gays in the military. That's going to be a long slog, and I wouldn't start there. I would change our policy in terms of being much more friendly to the court and talking about when we might eventually be able to join, but I wouldn't start there. Closing Guantanamo, absolutely, and not just closing Guantanamo, announcing that
We are abiding by the Geneva Conventions. We are abiding by the Convention Against Torture for all of our officials, CIA and military, and if necessary, that we are working with other nations who also have apprehended terrorists who need, so that we have agreed interpretations as to what interrogation is permissible, what detention is permissible. We are in a different situation. We are facing different kinds of enemies. There's nothing wrong with updating the rules, but we play by the rules. The other thing that I would recommend is that I think the United States should lead the effort to reform the UN Security Council and do it for real. We've never done this for real. We basically say we support Japan because we know China will knock Japan out. But I think it would be hugely important for us to say, look, we helped create this organization. We recognize in 2009 that we have to make room at the table. We have to make room at the table for Brazil, for India, for African countries, for a Muslim country, and we understand that if we don't do that, this organization is becoming increasingly illegitimate. I think it would go a long way in the world to see that we're serious about actually making room in that order we created for the world that we're in, not the world that we'd like to remember.
What about a full court press on the Israel-Palestinian issue?
Well, that would be nice, not waiting 7 years to, to decide to really engage. Again, you know, lost opportunities, missed opportunities. We have so many difficulties now. Hamas has half of Palestine.
Right. So should that be a priority of the next administration?
Certainly it should be a priority.
Is anybody out there willing to do it? Nobody's talked about it.
In Hillary Clinton's Foreign Affairs article, there's a big point that would be an immediate focus.
But she knows the pitfalls from what happened to her husband.
Yeah,
I was there at Camp David.
I was there too.
We were both there.
You know, maybe she'll send Bill. We'll keep him busy, so he can take care of that.
Maybe he'll get a do-over.
A do-over, right. He'll do it right
sir.
this time.
Nation building, much maligned by the current administration and its ideological supporters. On the other hand, the real world is full of states that have failed. Somalia's, the Darfur Sudan situation, spin-offs of the Soviet Union, and so on. Do we need to revive in some way a coherent practice of having the United Nations or NATO or some other mechanism that takes states, failed states in charge, sort of a return to the mandates of the League of Nations a century and more ago, to build a civic society and to build democratic institutions before holding an election in a country that has neither and then declaring it solved?
Yes, we need to understand that it is it's a much longer term process. That's why I talked about liberty under law, or what our founders called ordered liberty. Emphasize the order first, and works on expanding liberty underneath it. I'm not sure we can go back to a UN mandate system. I think the world is in a different place. I do think that we can work much more put much more emphasis on a combination of regional organizations and global organizations, marshaling the combination of non-governmental organizations, the private sector, and public organizations for a coordinated effort where we recognize we're talking probably decades in many of these countries, but that it's not just development aid, it's long-term, it's a combination of trade, of development assistance, but also of what the EU's done so well, which is to integrate fledgling governments into larger structures where they get help, they get technical expertise, and they are there's a cost to deviating from the fragile path that they're on.
Yeah, I think, the State Department desperately needs more resources for this kind of work. Whenever I read that the Pentagon is complaining that the State Department isn't stepping up to the plate and so on, you just have to look at how small the diplomatic service is. There was a controversy, I think you probably all read about it, with Condoleezza Rice now having to order diplomats to go to Iraq because they can't get enough warm bodies. There are only something like 7,000 Foreign Service officers. And, about 1,000 of them have already been through Iraq once, some of them more than once. So I would take some of the money away from the Pentagon, which has more than it needs, and definitely invest more of that in the State Department. There is an office now which deals with stabilization, post-conflict stabilization, but it's very small and underfunded, and also work with the UN organizations, which have a lot of experience in this area.
It should be pointed out, though, that given the budget disparities and the fact that the military has more people in Iraq by a factor of 20 than the State Department does, a lot of those young men and women are going through second and third tours there as well.
They are indeed.
The young woman up front here.
Yes. I have two questions. One, I guess one is there a role for the UN with regard to helping to diffuse the hostility that's coming from the Bush regime with regard to Iran? Is there something besides the Security Council that can be helpful with regard to that? And then second, it's also with regard to the UN. Is there a way the UN can help to withdraw U.S. troops? And how does that play then in terms of stepping up the UN role now? If it's involved in the U.S. troops being there, will that mean it'll be harder to have it be helpful to withdraw U.S. troops if that's desired?
I have to say I kind of miss Kofi Annan. He spoke out very forcefully against using the Security Council against Iran. He didn't think it was a good idea.
Well, al-Baradei's been trying.
Al-Baradei is sort of, Mohammed al-Baradei, the head of the IAEA, is sort of trying to step into that role, but the current head of the UN seems to be much more docile and supportive of the Bush administration in this way. He certainly doesn't make public pronouncements about issues like this in the way that Kofi Annan did, for good or for ill. In terms of troops, the UN had a very traumatic experience. It had a fairly large mission in Iraq, and it was blown up in August of 2003, and the head of the office, Sergio de Mello, was killed. A lot of other people were killed. So they do have an office which has come back into the green zone, and they are slowly bringing people in. But this is a problem of the U.S.'s making. I don't think we can expect anybody else to extricate us from it. We're going to have to figure it out ourselves.
Tell you what, getting the wrap signal, but we've got 4 people standing up. Why don't we take questions from these 4 people, and then we'll cut it off there. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Pardon me? No, I think if we handle them quickly, we'll get through. I'll see how I can exercise my moderating skills here and see if we can get through this quickly. Go ahead.
I'll exercise discretion and be concise as well. In terms of the same question of how would you advise or would you change U.S. policy, I wanted to direct it to Afghanistan in particular. And 60 Minutes recently did a piece where they were focusing on how the lack of ground troops meant a greater focus on air power and the effects that has in terms of collateral damage and winning the hearts and minds. And I was just wondering, would you change, and if so, how, our approach to Afghanistan?
One of the books I've been reading on my sabbatical is Sarah Shea's The Punishment of Virtue, and she basically has been describing the Taliban coming back in Kandahar, and of course the next chapter in that book happened last week. I mean, they're in Arghandab, right outside of Kandahar. I think the best that we can do right now in Afghanistan is to hope that we fight the Taliban to a draw before the winter, before things stop in the winter, and then we're going to have to work intensively with NATO to try to get more troops in, but to change our overall approach, which, from her point of view, is, it's not okay to support the warlords on the assumption that, they're the best we can do. You've got to ultimately work for, forget democracy, let's talk about decent government, so that the population supports you. And, doing that now is really hard.
Ron?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I got to give you a lot of credit for even talking about these things, because I think the train has so left the station in this world. I've sat at UN meetings since 1988, focused on issues, real tough issues like narcotics trafficking, selling of children, human trafficking. Now we're selling, every commodity, the privatization, globalization, the bad side of all of that. We've been driving that. We're the biggest player.
Yeah.
Okay. If you look at AIDS, you look at narcotics, these are issues that the whole world shares. Us included, we're not exempt from these issues. These are things we could have worked together on. I don't think I don't think we were ignorant of that. Do you? No. We know we share these issues, and these are things that we can do together. We chose not to. Okay? Now, stay with me for a second, all right? And I'm going to ask you to respond to this. But don't you think that there's more mega billions of dollars and trillions of dollars to be garnered, and power and resources to be garnered by not solving the problem, by working the problem?
So you're saying, is there a reason to not address the issue as opposed to...
I really am,
So?
I hate to be that cynical, but I really think that there are small numbers of people who sit in a room and they say, how can we come up with another oil for food scheme, and then siphon the money off?
Well, that's
I'm not that cynical. I really am not that cynical.
I'm getting to the point where I really believe that we are involved in global crisis induction. That's what we do.
So let's let them respond to that.
Yeah, no, I'm not that cynical. I really think the UN still is trying to do good, and that, yes, there is corruption, and yes, there is inefficiency. But when you see what the U.S. has done in Iraq, frankly, it makes the UN look good by comparison.
Again, if we could try to form our questions in the shape of a question, that would be helpful. Go ahead. Oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Good evening. I'm a foreign correspondent for selected Czech and Slovak media based in New York. And I found it kind of interesting that during the discussion you never touched on the issue of Islam as the theological ideology, which I dare to say the Islamofascism, although it's not PC. Which I try to trespass as much as possible the PC concept. It's a very Eastern European thing. So how do you see the role of Islam? We're dealing with a death cult which doesn't really talk about life and talks about... No, I mean...
It's not true. I'm sorry. It's not a death cult.
There is a fantastic book...
It is not a death cult.
There is a fantastic book by Ibn Vara called Why I'm Not a Muslim. You all should read it.
I've known lots of Muslims, I assure you. It's not a death cult.
I'm not going into the discussion about whether it's not or correct or not correct. The question is we're dealing not only with the political strategy, but also dealing with the ideological religious strategy. And I want to...
I reject your terms of reference completely. There are a small number of extremely unpleasant people.
They are not small number.
Who have fomented acts of terrorism against the United States.
And overall, it's a small percentage.
Yeah, overall, when you look at the number of Muslims there are in the world and the amount of violence, it's a very small number. And there are such vast differences between sect and country and country
none
that
of these
one
people
cannot ever lump them together. And the word Islamofascism, I don't understand what it's supposed to mean. There are no Hitlers marching around that I see. It has nothing to do with...
You know what it means? It means that they killed Theo van Gogh. They're threatening all the people who are trying to speak open-mindedly. There is no open forum for discussion. That's what it means. That's a fascism. This is sort of the political...
I think you're mixing two historical circumstances, and that you have to look at each one in their own.
I lived under the communist fascism, okay? I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I can recognize the aspect. I mean, you're trying to diffuse it, but the fact is that so far didn't have any group which will stand up and say, no, you do not represent us.
Let's let Anne-Marie make a quick response, and then we'll move on to our final question.
I think you want to fight the ideology that moves Al-Qaeda, that moves specific groups,
Exactly.
Absolutely. But I think calling it Islamofascism is a terrible mistake. It also reflects the fact that what the Bush administration is doing, or anyone who thinks that way, that's approaching the 21st century world with a 20th century mindset and seeing it all through the lens of the last wars in the last century, when in fact we face a much wider range of problems in a much more complex situation that cannot be reduced to a single enemy with a single ideology.
That was my point.